Hello, my name's Gordon Port, and I'm one of the trustees of the Natural History Society of Northumberland, and it's a pleasure to bring you another in our series of Talking Naturally. And today I'm talking to Chris Metherell. So Chris, would you like to say a little bit about yourself? Tell us who you are.
Yes, I'm Chris Metherell. I'm the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland's Vice County Recorder for North Northumberland. That's a bit of Northumberland, which is north of the River Coquet. And I live in Felton, which is about, my house is about 150 metres north of my southern border, so it's very convenient. And like Gordon, well, I used to be a trustee of the Natural History Society, now happily retired. Also, I used to be the president of the BSBI for a couple of years, 4 or 5 years ago, pre-COVID, happily also retired. And I also serve as their referee for Iberites, rather pretty little annual plants that you see all over the place, rather difficult to identify. Some arrived this morning for me to identify, determine.
So do they come as specimens or as pictures?
Oh, specimens. You can identify them from pictures if the person taking the pictures is a real expert and knows exactly what to photograph. But people take photographs of the flowers, and that's the last thing I need to see practically. So photographs can be very difficult. Press specimens. Yeah.
So Iberites are really one of your specialist topics, but I mean, how did you get into natural history, or have you always been from birth a natural historian?
Well, I was thinking about this the other day, and I suppose part of it, I mean, I was brought up in Bournemouth, which is about as far away from Northumberland as you can get, almost anyway. And I was very lucky because I lived right on the eastern fringe of the town. And so about 150 metres from where I lived were fields. And we had a very nice river with water meadows and things. I don't expect they're water meadows anymore, but they used to be in those days. Maybe it's 100 metres away, 200 metres away. And the area I lived in was just in the throes of being developed for housing. Although the house I was in was 1940s, but behind it, where the fields were, with the hares and rabbits and all sorts of stuff, hadn't really been built on. And there was a huge area called Petersfield Common. It wasn't common land, it was owned by somebody, but it was big, and that's where we used to play. And I now realise, in fact, that natural history terms, it was a fantastic place. I mean, you probably had smooth snakes and all sorts of things. So although I lived in was really a big town, I was really lucky because I was right on the edge. And so I suppose I sort of absorbed a lot of that just by seeing things. And I think I'm one of those natural, I want to name things person. I like to know what I'm looking at. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's a car or an airplane or a plant, you know. Naming of the parts, I think, is sort of hardwired into me. And so I guess that's probably how I got involved, was by wanting to know what it was I was seeing.
Oh,
in a very dilettante sort of way.
Yes, yeah, and so it's grown sort of organically from that point on. But was there anybody who was particularly influential in helping you, or were you alone sort of?
Well, I don't know they were very helpful. I mean, this was an era, of course, when I mean, there were clubs and societies around the place, but they didn't seem, I'm not saying I would be, they wouldn't welcome young people, but they certainly won't go out of their way to find them. And certainly one was never recommended to go and join a wildflower society or a birding group, or come to that, a rugby club. I mean, it just wasn't what kids did, or certainly most kids. So, and once again, I was thinking about this the other day. The big problem at the time, particularly if you were a naming of the parts person, was that there were no books. Right. Because, I mean, there were very expensive books that you could look at in a library, but there were no picture books, apart from, say, library books. And that was a sort of 6-volume thing or something about British birds that you couldn't take out. And because, of course, the first picture book came out in well, in paperback, I think in 1969, I think that was Keble Martin's.
Yes, I think I've got a copy.
Yeah, well, it was first picture book I bought.
Yes.
And I just before I went up to university, so I took it with me. But prior to that, I mean, you ask about people, I happen to know the local librarians very well. There's a little bit of a story here because my mother used to go shopping on Fridays, and the supermarket she went to, we had supermarkets in those days, we didn't have any books, but supermarkets, was near the library. So she used to dump me in the library and then go off and do the shopping and come and pick me. It's not a safe place to be. So I've always been used to being in libraries and interacting with the librarians. And I remember asking them, this particularly nice chap, I want a book on plants because I'd like to know. And I think I'd already worked out they had no books on birds that were any use. And anyway, there was a bit of sort of this behind the desk. And eventually they came back and said, well, we haven't really got anything very much, but we might try this. And he handed me this tome, which was like a brick. And I thought, well, I'll give it a crack, And I now know, of course, it was Clapham, Tooting and Warburg.
Ah, yes.
I was 11, I think, or 12.
It's not really the appropriate age.
I'm trying to be helpful, but but my memory, this may be a false memory, but I don't think so. My memory is of sitting in my mother's front garden with the Clapham, Tooting and Warburg. It's a nice sunny day, and I thought, well, I'll see if I can work out what some of these plants are. Well, I don't know whether you've ever tried to use Clapham, Tooting and Warburg or any flora, starting from page 1 on the wide, family descriptions and trying to work your way down. Well, of course, it was a complete failure. I got absolutely nowhere. Didn't put me off. And I now know that the plant I was trying to look for was Euphorbia peplis, which is, is not exactly that plant you start beginners off on using a key. So, but I suppose, that sort of fed into the, come on, somebody knows about this. Somebody's written a big book about this. They know how to do it. Well, I ought to know how to do it too, I suppose. So yes, it was perhaps one of the critical moments. It was that annoyance of not being able to do it.
So the librarian sort of nudged you along, at least to know the way that some people do it. But then, as you grew more experienced, did other people influence you, or? Well,
they did, but not for a very, very long time. Because, as I said, I went up to university. I was at University of Reading, which had a botany department and a herbarium, which I had never used, and I never interacted with the botany department. But the plus was it was on a huge campus.
Yes.
And at that stage, the campus wasn't quite as developed as it is now. And I mean, it's big, still the same size, but it's got a lot more buildings on it now. And so, sunny summer's evenings, I used to take my Clapham, Tooting, Warburg, my Keble Martin out, and wander around and see what I could find. And I never met anybody else who was interested.
So, what were you studying at Reading?
Geography and geology.
Oh, right. That would account for why you didn't have any sort of contact with botany.
No. I mean, I can remember occasionally I did go out into the countryside, into Berkshire or Buckinghamshire, to look for plants. I can remember going to the university, very good university library at Reading. And I remember reading Watsonia, because at the back of Watsonia is a huge list of where you can find what's just been discovered. And I remember looking at those and seeing if there's anything locally that I might go and try and find. So I mean, I did go a little bit further afield, but no, there was nobody really. It was just a lone activity at that stage, I think. And then got married and moved to Scotland, to Dundee. I used to work in professional theatre recently when I left uni, taking my Keble Martin with me. And by then, of course, Fitter, Fitter and Blamey had come out, which was you could put in your pocket. It was a nice pocket picture book. And because my wife and I then had jobs, we could afford to buy a camera. A single lens reflex camera. It was a Practica, not brilliant, but it worked fine. A bit, bit of bounce on the shutter, but it was all right. And we had a car, so we could go out and take photographs of flowers. And in fact, on my honeymoon, we stopped at Ben Law's on the way round, but Scotland. We had to end up in Dundee because that's where I was starting my job. And so we spent a happy day on Ben Lawes looking at the plants.
Yeah.
And I've still got the book I bought on that occasion with the little notes written in. So my wife was reasonably interested in plants. And so it was at that stage, it was taking pictures.
Yes, yes. So that's a long journey, isn't it? All from Bournemouth all the way up to Scotland to Dundee. And then when did you come to the North East?
Well, the trouble with working in the theatre in those days, and I'm sure it's the same now, is all contracts, short-term contracts. So I stayed in Dundee, it was, I suppose 2 years, yes. And then I got a job at what used to be the Gulbenkian studio around the back of the University Theatre in Arsenal. Yeah. It's now part of the main theatre. And I was studio manager there for 2 years, I suppose, again. And then the next contract was in, so that's how I ended up in Newcastle, which is Charles. Yes. Well, my first wife, in fact, came from Northumberland, as it happens. Family came from near Netherwhitton. And so the next contract was Birmingham. Now, I've got nothing against Birmingham. Well, actually, I have. I didn't like it at all. It's just too big, and I just really didn't want to go. So I retrained as a lawyer.
Wow, that's quite a change.
Well, one sort of theatre to the other, really,
Yes.
And I mean, I was a sharp end, court advocate.
All right.
I did, although I was a solicitor. I was a solicitor advocate, and so we did that really to stay in the North East. Yeah. Because I could relatively easily get a job in the North East. So that's how we landed here. And so I didn't really. I mean, I did bits of botany, looked at stuff, but it wasn't until I would think the early 2000s that I really started getting involved. And that was a bit of a mistake, really, because but it wasn't a mistake. It was just chance. I'd been one of my roles. By then, I was working as a prosecutor, so I was government lawyer. One of my roles was to train police officers in legal. Yeah. And I was teaching a course, Chester, somewhere like that. I can't quite remember. And it finished early. It finished at lunchtime on the last day, instead of 4 o'clock or something. So I had a free afternoon, and I've been reading some stuff about botany in the North East, and there was a plant which I thought would be rather fun to go and see, try and find. And it was, I don't know his English name, it's Mibora minima, early hairgrass or something like that. Right. And but I didn't know what it looked like. Well, I've seen pictures of it, but no, so I thought, now I know that there's a site in Southport where it grows on the prom, really easy to find. Yeah. I suppose I must have got it off the internet or book or something. And so this was just a moment. I was driving practically past Southport Road End on my way home from it was. So I stopped in and found the Mibora minima. It was easy to find, and made sure I knew what it looked like. And then when I got back, I thought, well, I better send the record in because it's quite a rare plant, really. Yeah. So I sent the record into the BSBI. Instant mail back saying thank you very much. It was a good record, and perhaps you might send us some more records and so forth and so forth. And that's really what did it, because after about quite a few more records, I retired, and the chap, somebody must have snitched on me, because the chap who I'd been sending the records to, a lovely guy called Alex Lockton, doesn't work for the BSBI anymore, phoned me up, I think, or emailed me, phoned me up, I think, and said, hey, I've heard you're retiring. You wouldn't like to be a Vice County Recorder, would you? Because the then Vice County Recorder in Northumberland was George Swan, who by then was in his mid to late 80s. Yes. And really, couldn't get out anymore, and it was just not practical for him to do much work. So somebody shocked me, really, and this was even before I retired. I mean, Yes. But in between, I had joined the BSBI, and I'd been on trips with the Wildflower Society, who I found were very, very good. So I had got more and more interested, I suppose. And then I just retired either the right or the wrong moment, depending upon which way you look at it.
Yes. Oh, well, I think from our point of view, you were in the right place at the right time. And, as they say, the rest is history. So I was going to ask you if you had a sort of really memorable sort of nature memory in the Northeast, but maybe it is finding that plant and sending that first record in.
Well, I think that was it actually. Yes, because I mean, there are some other memorable moments. I mean, not particularly in the Northeast, but I can remember going on my first trip with the Wildflower Society. A brilliant bunch of people. I mean, incredibly well. Everybody in botany is incredibly welcoming. It's one of the really good things about botany. I've never met an unpleasant botanist.
Yes.
Perhaps they exist, but I don't think so. Anyway, I remember going on my first Wildflower Society trip, and I turned up, and of course everybody had these hand lenses, and I thought, oh, my eyesight is perfectly good, thank you very much. I can see without a hand lens. Well, of course you can't. You know,
yes.
First thing I learned was borrowing somebody else's hand lens. Crumbs, that's exciting. You know, go out and buy one in Newcastle as soon as I got back. So that was quite an interesting moment. My penny sort of dropped. That was more to botany than, because I think up to then on the whole, I'd been looking at flowers. And I remember seeing my first sedge on this trip. I don't know, sedges existed, you know. So yes, I mean those were good moments. I suppose they were sort of formative stuff. Yes.
Yes. Yes. Hand lens. I think somebody said that if they had enough money, they'd just buy a hand lens for every child in the country, and then they'd all become naturalists.
Yes. Yes, that's right. They should be issued at birth.
Yes. That would be good, wouldn't it? So you've been around the country, travelled around, but in particular in the Northeast, where are your favourite places to go to?
Oh, well, that's easy. Holy Island is the place.
Right.
I feel I'm sort of I'm attached at the hip to Holy Island. I mean, it's just such a fantastic botanical site, and it has all sorts of advantages. I mean, one of which is, of course, it gets cut off by the sea. So, and when it's cut off, on the whole, it's empty.
Yeah.
So, you know, the tourists disappear mostly as soon as the tide starts coming in. They've got to get back into the mainland, and you've practically got the island to yourself. And I don't think there's anywhere else in Northumberland that has such a range of interesting plants of all sorts. And I mean, I've been going there. I mean, it's very well botanized, obviously. People have been going there for years. So the botany is extremely well known. But every year you find new things.
Yeah.
You know, I found Traveller's Joy there this year. I mean, Traveller's Joy is commonplace in the south, but it's not common in Northumberland or North.
That's right.
And there it was on Holy Island. I mean, must have been there for a bit. It's just that nobody noticed it. And in the last over the COVID period, we've started getting bee orchids, for example, on Holy Island.
Yeah.
Never been there before, but I've been moving northwards, and I think there are 3 populations now on Holy Island, something like that. Yeah. So it's fantastic, fantastic, and it doesn't involve climbing up hills either.
That's true. It's fairly flat. But yes. And do you go there at all times of the year? Or, I mean, obviously there's a peak season for doing botany, which is when things are in flower. But what about in the winter time? Is it equally interesting?
It is. It is. I mean, because it's an island, obviously, it has you know, all sorts of lovely seaweeds. I'm quite interested in seaweed. I'm not an expert by any means, but I think they're quite fascinating things. Most amazing reproductive systems you've ever come across, and it's also a hotspot for Salicornia. Salicornia is not a plant that most people find very exciting. Green, squabbly things. I mean, that's yay high. But my wife and I, my second wife is quite an expert botanist, so that's quite handy. And we've got ourselves interested in various difficult groups of plants. Salicornias are quite difficult to tell one from the other. And Holy Island is a hot spot for them. Again, I mean, there are 4, well, depending on what you believe of the taxonomy, there are 4 or 5 different species on Holy Island. You can't identify them until late September or October, something like that. So it's not all year round, but the seaweed's there all year round, so it's pretty good.
Yeah. So I mean, it's obviously a good place to go. You would prefer it if people didn't go there that often because you want to be there on your own.
Well, it's always difficult, isn't it? I mean,
Yes.
you think back to the COVID
Yes.
lockdown a few years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And I mean, we've been banging on about people having access to the countryside. The countryside is good for you, makes you feel better, all that sort of stuff. And which is absolutely right, of course. People ought to be out in fresh air and out enjoying the countryside. But as soon as lockdown stopped, people rushed out into the countryside and of course weren't used to it.
Yeah.
They maybe left the gates open. They had barbecues in places they shouldn't have had barbecues, you know, and so forth. And so it's always a two-edged sword. You know, if you have pressure of lots and lots of people, you potentially you start destroying the very things that you want the people to see. Yeah. It's an impossible problem. I mean, it's because we're a crowded island and we haven't got enough space really to cope with all. I mean, I think Holy Island fairly recently had its first year when it had 1 million visitors.
Right. So yes, it's fairly popular.
It's a tiny island, and luckily they mostly like be in the village and they go up to the castle and they see the abbey and so forth, and they don't on the whole stray out to the wilder areas where the sensitive habitats are. But then it's difficult. You want people to be out there.
Yes, yes. And of course, all those tourists, we always see stories about people getting stuck when the tide comes in unexpectedly. If you've been a very frequent visitor, have you had any close calls with the tide, Chris, or you've always managed it?
It would be so embarrassing, you know, because I mean, we know quite a few people on the island now.
Yes.
And it would be very embarrassing if we got stuck. So no, I've never even come close.
Or at least you're not going to admit it.
You know, I've seen lots of pictures and people getting stuck. It's
not a good thing. But if Holy Island's getting very busy, is there anywhere else in the northeast where you would think to go that's away from it all, where they are follow?
I mean, the Cheviot is very, very nice botanical area, and is in some ways is kept not free of people, obviously, but I mean the numbers are restricted because the easy access through Hefpool is controlled by the local estate, and they will only allow so many cars, 15 a day or something, to use the estate roads, a permit, and so that automatically restricts. I mean, obviously people can walk in, but it's a long walk from here.
Yes,
you know, Cheviot, and you can get around the back through Hershall Lynn, but again, it's a jolly long walk, and not many people do that. So that's quite an unspoiled area, and it's lovely. The other place, which was a bit of a sort of jaw-dropping moment, actually, because I mean, I've been living in the northeast, I don't know, 30 years or something, and one day I was looking at some maps, and I thought, there's this road that goes right out through Rothbury and then to Thropton, and then on to Sharperton, and then on up the coast to our Winton, and then up right further up. I thought, I've never been up there. I'll go and have a look. It was a nice sunny Sunday or something, and I was on my own. So off I went, and it is the most stunning part of the county, and nobody goes.
Yes,
because there are no shops. There's a pub in All Winton, but that's as close as you get. There are no shops. There are no places selling candy floss or whatever. It's just pure country. And so very few people go there. And it's jaw-dropping and a beautiful place.
I think we're very lucky, both in Northumberland and Durham, to have some really sort of secluded areas you can get away to.
Well, Teesdale's a bit like that, isn't it? I mean, again, it's not easy to get to. It's quite a drive. Yeah. Even if you live in, say, Durham, or even if you live in the Bishop Auckland or somewhere, it's still a hike. Yes. And so it's quite despite the fact that it's got a rather nasty reservoir in the middle of it now, it's still a lovely place. Yeah.
Can I take you back to your sort of early associations with the Botanical Society of the British Isles, BSBI, because you were tapped on the shoulder to become the recorder.
Yes.
but I know that you actually have gone on to eventually become president of the BSBI. So can you describe that journey, and what's the BSBI like for those people who haven't got to know? No, only good stories.
Well, I think the trouble is, I mean, it's undoubtedly got the aura of a learned society.
Yeah.
And to be fair, that's not undeserved, because I mean, a lot of the people who are members, they're a professor this, doctor that, whatever the other, and are real, botanical experts in their field. Although less so now, because of course botany is not much taught in university. Yes. So it does have this aura of being a learned group of people, and that can be very off-putting, I think. And I mean, it didn't put me off particularly, but I think for a lot of people, they find that difficult. And it's not like that at all. I mean, it isn't like a learned society. Well, actually, most learned societies are very friendly organisations. Yes. I'm also a fellow of a Linnean Society, and they're incredibly friendly, jolly bunch, from very, very high power people, but doesn't stop them, because I think most people who have some degree of expertise in their field are only too pleased to find somebody else that wants to hear them giving it that. That's what they like doing. They like telling you about it. And so I think that was the thing I discovered about the BSBI. And I mean, what happened was I've been recorder not for very long, and the recorder next door in those days, north about, was Michael Braithwaite, who was a very, very good botanist, long retired, but still alive. And he was a recorder for Berwickshire, BC 81. And so I got to know him because he was very helpful, extremely enthusiastic, a very nice chap. And when I first became a recorder, he straight, lickety split, got in touch and said, any help you need, whatever. And so I used to email him the questions to this quite often. And then he became a president of the BSBI.
Right.
And in those days, it wasn't the organisation it is now. It was very, it was run almost entirely by the members. Nowadays, it's not. We have a chief executive and all sorts of members of staff. We didn't have any staff in those days. I mean, maybe we had one. And so it was entirely run by the members. So the president was a really powerful person. They ran the show. And so Michael asked me if I would be a trustee, be on the BSBI council.
Yeah.
And it was more or less understood that relatively new botanists would come onto council and they do 3 years and then they disappear off again, and then maybe they'd pop up again in 4 or 5 years' time. It was like a sort of a bit of a learning curve, really.
Yeah. And
so I did when Michael was president, and then I mean it's the wrong place at the wrong time again. I had, let's say, retired, being a lawyer. But the BSBI was going through a change to make itself into a different sort of charity. Being a charity, I mean, it wanted to be a charity limited by guarantee. And as it happens, I'd set up charities when I was in private practice. I'd done it, and very rare for lawyers to do that, but I have had to do it a couple of times. And so they said, well, would you carry on being a trustee, because you can help. You'll understand at least some of the legal bits and pieces. So I got stuck with being a trustee of the new BSBI.
Yes.
And then they lost their honorary general secretary, and quiet words were had, and then blow me down, I became the honorary general secretary for about 4 or 5 years, which was great fun. And then I became a president after that.
Right.
So shoulder tapping going on, yes.
Yes. Just a series of stepping stones through the organisation almost.
Yeah, well, that's right. But I mean, so I think that's the way I think that quite a lot of people move through those sorts of organisations, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
And of course, now the difficulty is a degree of tongue biting, because I'm absolutely convinced that once you've done it, you step back. You're not going to do it again. You should just shut up. If people have got a problem or they need some assistance and you can help, well, of course that's different. They'll ask. But really annoys me when people who are ex-presidents or whatever think that they know better. Well, they don't. It's the new people's job now. They've got to sort out whatever it is, and you just have to sit back.
Yeah, so these organisations change constantly, as I
Yes.
know from my association with the Natural History Society. So when did you first become involved with the Natural History Society?
Well, I must have joined, I think, in the early 2000s. The answer is I can't remember.
Yeah.
Probably in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
When I started being more interested in botany. And those days, again, it was quite a bit of a different organisation from the way it is now. It was, I think a fantastic thing about Natural History Society, which is absolutely top-notch stuff, is this sort of just do it attitude. Let's just do it. If it doesn't work, well, we can always undo it. We haven't, nobody's going to die. It'll be fine, and if the worst thing that can happen is it doesn't work out terribly well. Whereas a lot of other organisations, you have to, they spend years thinking about it, and by then the moment's passed and everybody's got bored, and so forth. And that's the trouble with bigger organisations with more staff, for example, much more difficult because you've got to consult people and all that sort of stuff. But somehow the Natural History Society managed not to do that. They've managed to get absolutely the best of both worlds, I think.
Yeah.
And so, I can't remember when I became a trustee. Once again, somebody must have tapped me on the shoulder. I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe.
Yes.
I did 5 or 6 years. And again, I thought, well, other people have got to do stuff. You can sit on the committee for ever and a day. It's bad. It's bad. You shouldn't do that.
Yes. Yeah. So going back to your interest in plants, have you written much about this, or
sorry, did I?
Have you written much about it? Have you written papers or books or anything like that? Or
yes. Well, the first thing I did, which was very, very useful, and now I've got a joint recorder, James Common, is my just appointed earlier on this year. Very, very good naturalist. And the first thing I did when I was appointed, 2008, I suppose, was for BSB. I had a very good system of what we call rare plant registers, and we still have, in fact. And the idea was that you would concentrate your recording effort looking at plants which were either rare or scarce locally, or more importantly, rare or scarce nationally. And you would compile a sort of site register, really, where they were.
Yeah.
They'd last been seen. And that would inform, you hoped, planning authorities and others. Well, I can't say that I ever thought it did very much. But so the first thing I did was to write a rare plant register for my vice county. And John Richards, who's my neighbour, Naturalist Society in the South Northumberland, did exactly the same thing. He beat me to it by about 2 weeks, I think. And that, of course, means that you really get to know, your vice county, get to know all those places that you really ought to go and have a look at, and you get to know all the plants. You get to know which ones are rare and which ones are important. So that was so we published that in 2010. So that was the first thing I wrote. And you can still get it, I think. It's free online, but you think you still can buy hard copies of it. And what else was done? Well, I wrote a book about eyebrights.
Right.
There's a very eminent botanist called Fred Rumsey from the Natural History Museum, now retired. And the BSBI published a series of handbooks about particular groups or genera of plants, and there was no handbook about eyebrights. And so we wrote a handbook describing all the eyebrights and hybrids and so forth. That came out in 2016, 2018, I can't remember, something like that.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting escapade.
Yeah.
We went all over the UK. We saw, I think we worked out, I was talking to Fred the other day, I think we were the only people we worked out who'd ever seen every species of eyebright growing in the wild in the UK.
Wow.
and a huge number of hybrids too. We went absolutely everywhere.
So when you were looking at the rare plants, presumably you were looking at records and finding out where things were or had been,
Yes.
or whether new things had arrived. So in your experience, do you think, are things getting better or are they getting worse in terms of biodiversity? Is it
well, I think, I mean, biodiversity is a rather large word.
Yeah.
And the answer is that it's very difficult to judge, I think. I mean, certainly there are plants that have suffered. For example, we have the only, Holy Island, have the only population of Carex maritima. It's a little sedge about yay high,
right?
Outside of Scotland, and we lost it.
Yeah.
Became extinct. And some plants certainly have been doing very badly. Mountain everlasting, for example, never a common plant. Well, I have never seen it in whatever it is, 50, 18 years of being a vice county recorder. It has occurred in Northumberland, but I've never managed to find it.
Right.
Gone from all its places. But then other plants are doing really well.
Yes.
I mentioned bee orchids. I mean, they've just gone whoosh, right? And we have a particular plant, purple milk vetch,
yes,
Astragalus danicus, and that's doing fantastically well. And our population in particularly North Northumberland, I think probably also in South Northumberland, is really nationally important population because it's an endangered species in the UK. But our population is absolutely thriving. I mean, every year I see it in places where I know it's new because I've been there before and I have not seen it, and now it's popped up.
Yes, yes.
And so some things are doing really well. Other things are not doing very well at all.
I'm going to ask you a really problematical question now. I mean, we've got some plants that are disappearing, other plants that are arriving and doing well. To what extent do you think that can be linked to changes in climate, or is it just too difficult to tell?
Well, I mean, with some plants, I mean, mountain everlasting, as its name implies, is traditionally a mountain plant. It does occur in lowland areas in particular circumstances. I mean, it occurs at sea level on Anglesey, for example, or used to. But I mean, essentially, it's a mountain plant. So as the climate warms, of course, low-level plants are likely to disappear.
Yes.
Because they're probably relics of some variety anyway, hanging on. And so, and the reverse, of course, is true with bee orchid, which is, has come up from the south. It's percolating northwards years. We're now big populations in Newcastle. It's got as far as north of Edinburgh, I think, quite a long way north of Edinburgh. I mean, that's obviously a climate change plant. It's here because the climate's warmed up.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, of course, it's never only climate. It's, I mean, it transpires that bee orchids particularly, their natural habitats, obviously rather disturbed, gravelly sort of places. They don't like lush meadows. And in cities and towns, we've got a lot of those, particularly now, because, filling stations are closing, all sorts of places are closing down, and they're leaving sites which are now going back to nature, and those are absolutely the right place. If you've got bee orchids marching towards you, that's where they want to be.
Right.
They'll be in whole car parks and places like that.
Yeah. So even if you're living in the middle of a town, there's all sorts of things to find.
Absolutely. I mean, the Natural History Society this year ran a very exciting citizen science project about orchids.
Oh yes.
Getting people to go out and look for them. And one of the really major successes, it wasn't in my vice county, but one of the major successes was, of course, where are people going to look? They're going to look on their doorstep. Where do they live? Where is their doorstep? Well, it's in Newcastle.
Yeah.
So they go around looking at brownfield sites in Newcastle, and they've discovered an incredible variety of orchids living in the last places you would expect. And of course, the last places that botanists go, because we like to go to Holy Island, Cheviot.
Yes.
We won't want to be stumbling around in the back alleys of North Shields.
Yeah.
And that's where the bee orchids are.
Right, right. So that's been a really exciting citizen science project, hasn't it? Because it's involved quite a lot of people. And I think, if I remember rightly, the results are going to be published in an edition of North East Nature, aren't they?
Yes, I should think it about. I'm just looking at the date. I should think it will be out in about 10 days' time.
So that's going to be just before Christmas in
Yes.
2022. Yeah. Oh, well, that's exciting. I'll look forward to that. And has that involved a lot of work from you, or has it been a collaborative effort for all sorts?
Well, the project was really driven along by my wife. My wife is Hazel is a pteridologist, ferns in her bag, but she's interested in other plants too.
Yeah.
Glassworks out of Cornwall. So I mean, we've been driving it along, but I mean, the Natural History Society have done all the administration stuff, and of course have been involved. James Conwell has been involved as a co-author of the next edition of the Northumberland Naturalist. So it's been very much a joint enterprise, and we had a great number of people doing a recording, citizen scientists. I mean, 70 or 80, I think. Well over 1,000 records came in, and some really exciting new finds. So it was very, very good. Great.
Well, we'll look forward to that. So the proverbial question now is, have you got any advice for your younger self? If you could get in a time machine and go back, what would you tell your younger self?
Well, in some ways that's a rather easy question, because one of the things I really enjoy doing is teaching people botany.
Yes.
Because I like teaching somebody a subject to make sure you have to know all about it. You know, and then you discover you don't know all about it, which of course is what science is all about. So yes, what I always advise people is, first of all, doing it on your own is okay, it's fun, but you get far more out of it if you're going out with other people. So the first thing I would say is get a hang lens,
yes.
Join a group, get out with some people. They're all nice people, they're always nice people, and you will start learning stuff that you never knew existed. You know, techniques that you would never dream of. It's the first thing. I think the second thing is something I've discovered over recent years, particularly because of the writing a book about eyebrows.
Yes.
Is that people don't use the resources which are available. And there are two resources that people don't, in my view, don't use. One is botanical gardens. I mean, we've lost our botanical garden in Newcastle. Disaster, really. I mean, knows why, but we have lost it. But we're only 2 hours from one of the best in the country, in Edinburgh. Royal Botanic Gardens there. And people think that botanic gardens are just about exotic plants or huge numbers of rare trees. Well, they have what they call systematic beds, and they're usually tucked away somewhere where perhaps most people don't bother to go. And in these beds are stacks and stacks of plants, many of which are natives, most of which are probably natives. And so you can get a sunny day, you can take your Bitter Fitter and Blamey or whatever book you're using, and you can sit by the geraniums.
Yes.
There will be 20 in front of you, and you can work them out. Yeah. And then when you get tired, you can go for a nice cup of coffee and a bun, and it's fantastic. And if it turns out it's pouring with rain on the day, you go, well, you don't do the geraniums, you just go and have a nice time looking at the palm trees and the palm trees.
Yes.
So, you know, they're all laid out for you. They're there. You don't have to stumble up a mountain to find them. You know, they're there. And the second thing is, and they often are in the same place, is a herbarium.
Right.
Dried plants. And as I said, when I was at uni, there was a fantastic herbarium in Reading. It's one of the country's best university herbaria. I never went in it. I didn't know it was there. If I'd known it was there, I would have probably thought, oh, well, it's only for real proper botanists. Absolute nonsense, of course. The herbaria are a fantastic resource, a bit like the flower beds in the Botanic Garden, except that it doesn't matter whether it's raining. And they have microscopes.
Yes.
So forth. So you can think, well, today I'm going to look at what I want to look at. I'm going to look at some geraniums. I'm having trouble with my geraniums. So you can go up to the herbarium at Edinburgh, and you can spend a very happy day going through all their sheets of geraniums. And when it says that this one's got glandular hairs, you can go, oh, so it has. I know what they look like. When I see them in the field, I shall know because I've never seen them.
Yeah.
So it's using all those resources, and people imagine that it's only for proper scientists to use. Absolute nonsense. I had a very interesting experience about 20 years ago. I can't remember why, but I needed to look something up in the what was then the British Library at Paddington. It might have been something legal, I can't remember. Anyway, and so I had to get a reader's ticket. Well, I had a reader's ticket for the old British Museum library when it was reading room, a round reading room in the British Museum, when I was a student. And I remember, well, you practically had to sign your life away in blood practically to get a reader's ticket.
Yes.
You have a recommendation from your professor to say you're a fit and worthy person, all this stuff, you know.
Yeah.
And eventually you got this ticket and you felt about that big as you walked around, you know. Anyway, well, it's not like that anymore. You just go into the library. You have to take your passport or something to prove who you are, and I don't know, electricity bill or something to prove where you live, and then you fill in the form and you sit in front of this very nice lady who's typing on the machine. And I said, this is a bit different from the way it was when I was a kid. And I remember doing this in 1970, and it was a nightmare. They said, oh yes, you see, these days we believe that these books belong to you. And of course, that's absolutely right.
Yes.
They don't belong to us. We pay for them.
Yeah.
We pay for all this. We pay, well, we probably don't, but taxpayers in Scotland and ratepayers in Edinburgh pay for the Botanic Gardens and their herbarium. We pay for it. It's ours. We should use it.
So, yeah, I think
those are the two things. Join a group, get yourself to the Botanic Gardens and preferably the herbarium, because once you've got there, once you've been in once, you'll realise what a fantastic resource they are, both of them.
Yeah, things have changed, but sometimes it's always good to see change for the better, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's always nice. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about your interest in plants and this very varied career you've had. What do you do other than botany, or is it just take up all of your time, Chris?
Oh, no. No, it doesn't. Unfortunately, it doesn't take up all my time. It probably wishes it could. First of all, I'm a dancer.
Oh, right.
I learned when I was at university. I'd never danced before. I'd always been interested in dance, but I'd never actually done any. So I learned when I was at university, and I set up, when we came to Newcastle, we met up with some other dancers, and we set up a dance research group, which is still running.
Right.
And
is this all forms of dance, or is it particular?
This is step and clog dancing. Clog dancing
All right.
is a big
Right.
thing. I was very proud to be awarded the folk world has a gong. It's a gold badge which is awarded by the English Folk Arts and Song Society. I awarded it to me a couple of years ago for my services to clog dancing. And you look at the list, it's very embarrassing. You look at the list of people, Ralph Vaughan Williams. Ralph Vaughan Williams? I'm not Ralph Vaughan Williams. Anyway, and so that takes up quite a lot of time, and I write books about that too. In fact, I've written, most of the books I've written are about dance.
Oh, right. Gosh.
And I'm also a musician.
What instruments?
Northumberland bagpipes,
right?
Naturally, melodeon, which is like a button accordion, small button accordion, and I also play a rather curious Swedish instrument called the nyckelharpa, which it tells me going to Sweden to play.
Right.
People play in the UK, so it's an excuse to go to Sweden. Lots of things.
It sounds like we need another sort of interview just about these other things that you're doing. Chris, that's been absolutely brilliant. I've learned such a lot. Obviously, we've known one another for some years, but it's really interesting listening to you talking about that. And I'm sure you'll find lots of other people would be interested in what you've had to say. So thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you, Gordon. Really good to talk. Cheers.
Okay.